Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here, and I'm so excited that you're joining me for part 7 of the Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this segment, I'm going to show you how to trim up the quilt and add the binding. Now, it's really fun to sometimes add a contrasting binding, and other times I like to make a really scrappy binding from leftovers. However, with this version of Blooming Wallflowers, I'm going to use the same binding that I used in the background fabric. It's this really cute print called Rainbows for my Black, White, and Bright collection. Now, sometimes I like to use the same fabric so that it has a nice, clean finish, and you don't even notice the edges around the quilt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the perimeter of the quilt. That's the edges on all 4 sides of the quilt, 2 of the length and then the top and the bottom. I'm going to add that number and add an extra 10 inches just for good measure. For my Blooming Wallflowers quilt, my number ends up being 280 inches. That's the amount of binding that I need to sew together. So to figure out how many strips I need to cut, I'm going to take that number, 280, and I'm going to divide it by 40 inches because that represents the length of one fabric strip that's about 40 to 45 inches wide. So if I take 280 divided by 40, I end up getting 7 strips. I cut out my binding strips using the AccuQuilt big electric die cutting machine and the 2-inch wide strip die. This will make a binding that finishes exactly 1/4 inches on both sides of the quilt. But you can totally cut yours wider if that's what you prefer. Remember, this is your quilt and you can make it any way you like. Next, I join the strips continuously by matching up right sides together at a 90-degree angle. You can mark the diagonal lines if you want to, but I just usually eyeball them. You don't need to match them up perfectly. That excess fabric will get trimmed away later. You can add one strip after another, just like I'm showing here, and the angle of the seam will be the same for the whole binding. After the strips are sewn, trim off the excess triangles with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can rotary cut them or you can use scissors. Again, because you've already sewn the seam allowances do not have to be exact here. The important thing is that the edges of the binding should be smooth. If your seam allowance is off, you can try it again, or you can just trim off any raggedy edges. Trim one end of the binding at a 45-degree angle. This will be your starting tail. Then press it wrong sides together with a hot, dry iron. Do this along the entire length of the binding. As you get to each seam, press the seam allowances open so that it's not bulky when you sew it to the quilt. The diagonal seams will also help distribute the bulk so that your binding is nice and smooth and appears seamless on your quilt. I'm making double fold straight of grain binding here, which works for all the quilts I've made so far. Really, the only reason you need to do bias binding is if you're binding a quilt that has curved edges. Now that the binding is ready to go, I need to square up the quilt. That means I'm going to trim the edges of batting and extra backing so that my quilt is nice and flush and easy to sew the binding on. I'm going to wrap the binding tightly around the quilt so it will create a fully stuffed batting, and there's no need to leave any extra batting. Now, if you have a different method of doing your binding and you want to leave extra, you can absolutely do that. Remember, you can change it up any way you like. But take a look at the way I'm going to show you, and let's see if that makes sense for you and your quilt. I'm using a large square acrylic ruler to trim up the corners first. This will ensure that my quilt has a true 90-degree angle at the corners. Now, it's nice if you have a wide border or extra background fabric so that it's not noticeable if you need to trim up a little bit of the quilt to keep it square. I'm cutting all of the batting and backing flush with the edge of the quilt for a nice clean finish. This will help ensure that my binding isn't all lumpy and that it's straight and even on both sides of the quilt. Once I trim 2 of the corners, I'll use a long acrylic ruler to trim the sides. I'll move it along with the edge of the quilt. I can use the ruler and also the lines on my mat to keep the cut nice and straight. I'll just throw away that excess batting and backing, but you can always save it to use as stuffing if you want to. I've machine quilted right up to the edge of the quilt, so it helps stabilize the edges as I trim. Now I'll do the exact same thing for the other 2 corners of the quilt. It really helps to have a nice big work table with a large cutting mat so that you can handle the bulk of the entire quilt. Once the next 2 corners are trimmed, I'll trim up the side again with the long ruler. Again, I'm making sure to match up the 2 previous points that were cut so that the trimmed edge stays nice and straight. Then I'll go back and trim up the other 2 sides the exact same way. Now that my quilt is all squared up and the binding is made, it's time to attach it to the quilt. For my blooming Wallflowers quilt behind me, I'm going to show how I sew the binding to the front of the quilt, wrap it around to the back, and finish with hand stitching. Now you can totally bind your quilt by machine if you like. In fact, I have a completely separate video tutorial showing just how to do that. So make sure you check out my YouTube channel for more fun things that you can learn and apply to this quilt. Just remember, change things up as you want to because you're the boss of your quilt. But for me, there's nothing better than sitting back, relaxing, and doing some hand binding. I might do it while I'm watching a movie on the couch, sitting by the pool on a nice day. Whichever way you like to do it, it's going to look great. So let's dive in and give it a try. Start with the cut angled end of the binding with the open ends lining up with the edge of the quilt. Leave about 5 to 10 inches of the starting tail unsewn and then begin stitching away from the corner of the quilt, somewhere along one of the sides. I'm using my Bernina dual feed 1/4 inch foot, the number 37D. You can always use a walking foot with a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead. When you get to the corner of the quilt, stop stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge. I like to fold up the binding to make a crease showing where the edge of the quilt is. On my foot, there's a marking that's about a 1/4 inch away from the edge, so that really helps line things up. Then sew off the quilt on the diagonal. This will create the mitered corner. Next, do what I call the funky fold. Turn the quilt and make sure the binding edges are straight, then fold it up so it's flush with the right edge of the quilt. Fold the binding back down on itself and make sure the fold matches up perfectly with the top of the quilt. If this part happens to slip, your corners may turn out a little bit funky. Continue stitching along the edge with a consistent 1/4 inch seam. When you get to the next corner, repeat the same process. Stop stitching a 1/4 inch away and stitch to the edge of the quilt. That funky fold is what will create the miter on the front and the back of the quilt. The corner will be a little bit bulky, so go ahead and give it some elbow grease and grab onto those threads so that you can start stitching again. Then repeat this process for all 4 corners and sides. When you get back to your starting point, be sure to stop stitching about 5 to 10 inches away from where the ends will join up. Roughly trim off some of the extra binding so that it's not in your way. Now I'll show you how to join the ends so that they look seamless. Take the ending tail with a straight end and lay it flat on the quilt, then open it up. Lay the starting tail with a diagonal end on top of it and open that up too. Then mark along the angled end so that you transfer the same angle to the uncut end of the binding. I'm using what's called a Hera tool, which makes a crease on the fabric. Now you're going to measure and cut 1/2 inch away from this mark to account for both of the binding ends. Use a smaller square ruler that has a 45-degree angle and match that line up with the top of the binding edge, then trim 1/2 inch away from the marked line. Match up both angled ends wrong side together and pin. You'll have about a 1/4 inch triangle tip sticking out on both sides of the join. Be sure you don't get these ends twisted up and carefully move the bulk of the quilt out of your way. Then slowly and carefully sew the ends together with 1/4 inch seams and trim off those dog ear triangles. Finger press that seam open and fold the binding together again. Then pin it back onto the quilt and finish sewing it down to create a continuous loop. You can test to ensure your binding will cover up the stitches on the back of the quilt, and you can roll out each of the corners to ensure the miters are going to look nice and crisp. You'll fold them on top of each other to create the miters in the corner on the back. Now it's time to secure the binding to the quilt. I like to use lots of wonder clips to secure the entire binding at once. I can wrap the binding around to the back of the quilt nice and tight so it won't slip while I stitch it down. I'll put clips on both sides near the corners. Then I'll fold the corner so that the bulk is on opposite sides and secure with a clip at the corner. Once the binding is all secure, I'm ready to hand stitch it down. I like to use leftover bobbins to hand stitch because it's really portable. I'm using a small needle and I'll thread it with about 15 inches of length to work with. Then I'll tie a quilter's knot by wrapping the thread around my needle about 3 to 4 times and pulling the knot through to the end. I'm using one strand of my Aurifil 50 weight cotton thread, and it works really well without getting all knotted up. I start by taking a stitch through the back of the quilt and then right in the fold at the binding to hide it. I'll tuck the extra tail ends into the binding. A thimble helps me push the needle through the fabric. I just do one stitch at a time and give it a little yank each time. Notice how I'm holding the bulk of the quilt in front of me and stitching from right to left. Now I've seen people do it the opposite direction, and that's totally fine. You just want to get comfortable with how you stitch. As I make my way across the quilt, I will remove the wonder clips as they get in my way. When I get to the corners, I like to stitch them closed. I'll take a few stitches on the back side, then push the needle through to the other side and stitch the miters closed on the front. It really helps to use a matching thread to hide all these stitches. The thimble helps push the needle through where it's really bulky at the corners. And this is just a nice touch that really helps secure the quilt and makes it nice and clean. Once the corner is stitched down, I'll keep on stitching to the next side of the quilt. Again, the process is catching the back of the quilt, catching the binding in the seam each time. It's really nice to get into a rhythm and enjoy the meditative process. When I get to the point that I'm about to run out of thread, it's time to knot the thread and secure the ends. I'll wrap the thread around my needle a couple of times and then take a stitch backwards to secure. Sometimes I'll tie another knot and take another stitch just for good measure. Then it's time to start the process all over again. Thread the needle, cut off a length of thread, tie the knot, and secure the stitches in the binding, then keep on going. It usually takes me about an hour of stitching per side of the quilt for a regular throw size quilt. Your timing may vary, so just enjoy the process. Once I've stitched all the way around the quilt and have returned to the starting point, I'll sew a few stitches beyond the starting point to secure it. Then I'll knot and secure the thread tails just like I did before. I really like hand binding because it hides the stitches and gives a nice clean look to the quilt. Now it's all ready to snuggle. I really enjoyed making this Blooming Wallflowers quilt, and I hope that you're following along. However, if you're new to this video, make sure you go back and watch all the videos on how to make this quilt from start to finish. All you need is a copy of the Blooming Wallflowers quilt pattern to follow along. Be sure to check the description box for links to all of the supplies needed to make this quilt. You're going to have a great time doing it, I know it.